So what we're going to do in this panel is really explore this healthcare system, this go-to-market strategy. How do we build off of this base that we just explored in panel 1 with this very rich clinical data that, mind you, may have been accelerated, which is quite exciting, but also leads you in a challenging environment of how do we take this relatively limited evidence base that we went to market with and prove ourselves to these various stakeholders. So with that as an open, I'd like to ask the panel, how do we do this? How do we go to market? How do we shape this market? How do we educate the stakeholders? And Kimberly, let's begin with you.
Thanks, John. Good morning, everyone. I'm Kimberly Freeman. I'm the head of global commercial for Adaptimmune. We are a clinical stage company that's engineering T-cell receptors, and we have multiple ongoing phase 1-2 trials in 8 different tumor types right now. And for me, it's a wonderful question, because when they initially hired me at Adaptimmune, I thought for a moment, is it too early to pull in a commercial person? And what I quickly realized was it's not, for exactly what we just talked about. And for me, I think the complexity around the value frameworks and looking at how we really analyze the cell and gene therapy space is critical. And I'll give the example of ICER, the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review here in the US, has initiated review of the CAR-T therapies already. And I think we just need to step back and ensure that these frameworks are really looking at the right elements. Do we have enough real-world evidence that we've generated outside of clinical trials due to what we said, the speed at which these products are coming to market? So I think for me, it's a big challenge to developers to ensure these clinical trials, as early as the pilot trials prior to pivotal, have the right endpoints and are demonstrating the right value so that we have the right things to measure. So,
thank you, Kimberly. Sure. I think that start early theme is something we're going to continue to explore today. Anne.
Yeah, good morning. So my name is Anne Dupras-Poiseau, and I am Chief Regulatory Officer at Orchard Therapeutics. So Orchard, it's a late-phase clinical trial company with offices in AU, London, and in the US, San Francisco. And we are developing ex vivo gene therapy for rare disorder, in particular primary immune deficiency and mucopolysaccharidosis. To answer your question, actually, with my regulatory hat, today key challenges is really to achieve convergence between regulatory and HTA payer requirement, in particular for this rare disease condition where you do not have the luxury to have multiple clinical trials. You need to start early, thinking about regulatory requirement, but also payer requirement. And I do think we need also for commercial success, we need also to think beyond benefit-risk ratio, but also access to patient. For example, in our case, it's quite important to think about potential early diagnosis and also educate, the health professional in order to consider gene therapy. One other point very important is geographic product availability for this rare disease condition, and thinking about fresh cryopreserve formulation. And last but not least, long-term follow-up of patients in terms of safety and efficacy. And when we think about real-world data, up to now they have been thought very often from a safety perspective, and how to use them also from an efficacy and effectiveness perspective. It's a key challenge.
That's exciting to hear, and it's just hearing you mention convergence, I think, is really a key theme that we want to talk about as well. I mean, just even a year ago, we might not have a regulatory perspective weigh in with a commercial perspective once we're on market or we're at that peri-launch period. Now, really, the game has changed. And maybe, Paul, this is something that you could speak to, because there are some common denominators in terms of solving for payers and regulators.
So my name is Paul Bresky. I'm the CEO of Jsight. We are a therapy. We're using a human retinal progenitor cell as a therapy for blinding diseases, with our target indication being retinitis pigmentosa. And we've completed a phase 1/2A study in 28 patients, and we have an extension study going on right now where we're dosing the fellow eye of the original patients. And we just initiated a phase 2B study. And all of the points that we discussed this morning, or that we heard in the panel we're discussing now, are very relevant to us right now. I think for us, given the stage where there are so many different moving parts, we have to pay attention to everything. And this particular topic is something we understand we have to pay attention to as early as possible, because some of the decisions that we're making now can impact exactly this as we move down the development path. One of the examples that I was thinking of as we were having these conversations is just paying attention, for example, to inclusion criteria in your clinical trials, because that can impact the payers. And so yeah, I mean, you spoke to this earlier. There's going to be a lot of do things as early as possible, and we also use the experts, do the studies, but that also takes a lot of resources. But it's a very important part of the development.
Yeah, so let's build on that theme, Avi. Given this start early concept, much as your panel did this morning, maybe you could talk a little bit about how you take what you're doing today in clinical development, making decisions about inclusion, exclusion criteria, patient-centered endpoints. There are other key milestones where perhaps you could be looking forward to launch and commercial access.
What's the question?
How do you bridge?
Sure. Thanks. For those who didn't attend the earlier session, pardon me, I'm Avi Kulkarni. I have the high honor of, within Quintiles IMS, heading up our stem cell center, which gives us a chance to participate and be part of this August gathering. Thank you. Thank you. To answer John's question two ways, I want to pick up a theme from the morning session that is really about, if we had played the game the way the game used to be played in terms of the development process, we would probably not be here today as excited as we are. Mm-hmm. Things changed. And the single biggest thing in my mind that changed was a willingness by a large number of agencies, not just regulatory bodies, to figure out what was the acceptable level of risk before we could put something into the body, and then what was the acceptable level of risk before we could chart the payer-based system, calling this an approval. It's a nuanced set of words there. Because if we had again used the old standard, we would not be here today. So in effect, what we've done is we've transferred risk longitudinally forward in time, accepting that we just know enough to put it into the body. Now, there's all sorts of dash points below that bullet point, right? The example of the kind of dash point that we're talking about here is we chose diseases and disorders which were, in a sense, easier to accept for the public, for the patient, for the providers who work with them, and therefore for the regulators. The risk classification of what we were dealing with allowed for some of this forward risk transfer. We accepted that we had just enough data to understand what we ought to be measuring for with follow-up studies. And some of the work that has come from Japan is very telling, in that we've got the cardiovascular approval, accelerated approval, with 5-year follow-up, with very defined endpoints. You couldn't get to that unless you knew what you were expecting to see. And so failure was built into that follow-up. Right? I think we'll all agree that with all of that, we don't exactly know what's everything that we ought to be testing for. Testing may not be the right word. Checking for. It's not really a bioassay, which is really the tie-in to both the early discussion as well as the point, I think, that answers your question, which is we have to be open today to almost the equivalent of open label registries. We will define what needs to be part of the cohort and the data that we'll test for, but we should also be open to inserting new endpoints or tests, because those will be relevant only after more biological and pathophysiological and response mechanisms are understood. And as we get through that, we will then be able to say, this is the phrase you and I have talked about, John, do more hind casting with longitudinal follow-up, pretend that we are back in time and say, if I was running an experiment on data, this is what I would see. You can start doing that to get to the kinds of claims you want to make. And then there's just one last point, and I'll pause, which is that we also need to figure out better ways to pool data sets. We're simply not going to be able to get by in this world at the pace we want with just one sponsor, one study, all the analysis from that sponsor's data set. And our industry's response to that challenge is going to help all of us as we get through that. So.
Thank you, Avi. I think before we venture into the pool of data sets, per se, let's talk a little bit about that regulatory comment you made. Last week I was in DC and at a real-world evidence workshop, and we were there talking about using real-world data differently in a regulatory climate. And Commissioner Gottlieb gave the opening remarks, and most of you probably have read some of it by now. It was covered across most of the press. But essentially, he's wide open to using real-world data differently to make regulatory decisions, to inform clinical development, and to follow up on patients long-term, and potentially change labels, expand labels based on real-world data. And I'd like to explore with the panel what that means to cell and gene therapy. It's clear that if you look at some obvious uses, like in orphan disease, they now have approved a product with a simulated control arm in Merkel cell carcinoma, essentially taking data from a retrospective data source and creating a comparator that they thought would be fit for an effectiveness or efficacy comparison in an RCT. So maybe we'll start with you, Anne, being the expert. Where's the room to apply real-world evidence in regenerative medicine?
So first of all, it will depend, which condition you are targeting. Because with ultra-orphan condition, as Orchard Therapeutics is targeting, there is no other way, to do it in a way. Because you do not have enough patients, to apply randomized, double-blinded, clinical trial. So you need to use actually your real-world data in order to have some insight about your control group. And also for cell and gene therapy, now that regulators require long-term efficacy and safety follow-up of the patient. With ultra-rare condition, it's also, in a way, a must to figure out, how to use this real-world data in order to achieve, this safety and efficacy long-term follow-up. So in the field, and I do think also with the approval of Streamvelis from GSK in Europe, they have set the scene over there with a 15 years, registry. So question for us as a, community is more how to collaborate between companies, but also with patient advocacy group in order to set, relevant registry that would be useful, for a regulator in order to follow up, safety and efficacy of this product, but also for payer to get the relevant, criteria.
That's a natural bridge back to you, Kimberly, in terms of potentially using real-world evidence to demonstrate real-world value to payers or HTA bodies. What do you think?
Yeah, so I'll first echo some of Anne's comments, because even in oncology, we're struggling enrolling patients in clinical trials. So it doesn't have to be an ultra-rare disease. I think the competition for patients with all the immunotherapies and cell and gene therapies is overwhelming. And I think to get to even a point where we have enough patients, much less changing some of these endpoints, which I'll get to in a minute, I think is a huge challenge for all of us to come together and try to find solutions. And for me, I think we're all going to these key academic centers for very good reason, right? They have the expertise and the knowledge, they have the transplant support, apheresis support, logistics support, all the pieces that go into administering this therapy to patients. And we have to find a way to branch to the community. And I think there are some very good community practices out there and very educated physicians and healthcare providers that could help augment our network. And we have to find a way to do clinical trials differently. I mean, this just is not going to have the longevity we need. So then back to your other question, an example I'll give is our therapy is a single infusion. What is the qualitative and quantitative benefit of a single infusion? And how do we demonstrate that to payers? And I think it's something that, maybe perhaps Novartis could have done a better job with, is explaining the benefit of that, explaining the cost of goods of these therapies and the complexities of why a certain price tag is assigned. And I think we have to do a better job at building that value story as really multiple companies. It shouldn't be a single company that's out there doing that. So, I don't have the answers today of maybe what all those unique endpoints and things are, but I would just, echo that single infusion and how do we demonstrate to payers and patients and healthcare providers the inherent value of that and what that does to a patient's, really long-term treatment pattern. So,
John, may I pick up on a theme that I just had started and we built up with Kim. For a long time, this discussion about what's the variable cost of making a pill versus what's the fully system-loaded cost, including all the development costs that have come before, have influenced the way we have approached the market and talked about messages. And we've been trying to solve for that problem in different ways. And I think registries have many purposes, but one purpose is to try and get to market early so that some degree of cost recovery can take place for the sponsor. That's just as one purpose. There's many, many more wonderful purposes of registries. The most recent autologous versus allogenic discussion actually gives us a chance to focus on the cost of the one pill in a highly expensive operational supply chain, where in fact the variable cost is high enough that were we to work with patient advocates and payer-based systems, we could make a case on cost alone. It's anathema to our industry to go where I'm going right now, but this is one time when we might be able to take advantage of the fact that we don't have to be positioning. It's an actual cost base. If the Inspector General came and inspected the cost of setting up these complicated electrophoresis centers and the turnaround time for actually modifying the drawn sample and converting it into drug substance that can be re-injected, I think we'd end up with a very large number. And so this may well be a time where we should maybe change the debate from what is the long-term price per dose that allows for a sustainable industry, which is almost always the right question to ask, to also say, right now, even if we got cost recovery, that would be a pretty good number. Sorry.
No, and I think that's a fantastic point. I think we are missing a potential opportunity to demonstrate that variable cost of the distribution logistics and how complex it is. But just to play devil's advocate from a payer perspective, having had a lot of these conversations, having a panel later today, we had one earlier this year to discuss this, they'll say, if I have to pay up front for a long-term cure with a one-time treatment, that investment I'm making in the patient is then essentially given to a competitive payer if I'm not in a single payer environment, which of course we're not in the US, at least for the time being in this administration. So if we do that, how do we create a safe harbor to essentially negotiate a payment model, an annuity type model with a payer to allow them to pay their fair share, but after the patient flips out of their system in 2 to 3 years tops, typically, the next payer pays their fair share. So I think that's what payers And I know that AHIP is lobbying down in DC and arguing for that the mechanism doesn't exist.
That's right, and I'll just, I'll echo that comment. We're part of a group at MIT doing financial modeling, forecasting, and what are all the options we could have from a payer solution. And it's great because we have payers at the table, we have advocates at the table, developers. It's really a nice group of stakeholders who have this common goal of exactly that. And how do we come up with a solution where it's an insurance policy, right? So this patient's getting this expensive, potentially curative therapy. And to your point, patients are not sticking around with one payer, right? They switch employers, they're moving plans, they enter the Medicare age population, right? If it's an ALL patient and they're in the pediatric Medicaid population, this all is very complex. And I certainly think, though, that there will be solutions. Certainly Novartis coming out with outcome-based pricing. I still am so interested to see how it's going to work and how it impacts the patient, most importantly, because if you think of a coinsurance on a $475,000 drug, that doesn't really sit well. And I'm sure there will be solutions to figure that out. But for me, I almost think we have to keep the patient at the forefront, and the insurers have to find a way. Is it a central fund that they all pay into for cell and gene therapies, knowing they'll gain patients, right? If you cure a 6-year-old with leukemia, that patient will pay into your system, hopefully for 70 years, 80 years, right? So I think payers have to put different hats on, but for me at Adaptimmune, the most important thing is how do patients access these medicines, and how do we develop the solutions for them? So.
Yeah, let's pivot to that theme with regard to the patient. I think that you could see new channels of information flow opening up with digital health and patients tracking their data with wearables, et cetera. And potentially that provides a channel for patient-centered endpoints for cell and gene therapy, where you can continue to capture the real-world benefit of these products that some are intangible, some might be quantitative and looking at direct cost, et cetera, but some might be intangible. And maybe, Paul, you could jump in here, because I know that the therapy that you're developing is not necessarily a one-time cure. It's more of a chronic treatment for chronic benefit. What do you think about that?
We discussed this earlier. I mean, it makes our challenges different. It's not a one-time treatment, but it's not necessarily a treatment that fits into any particular model that's out there. So the payers are used to monthly, yearly, but this could be patient specific, and it could be 18 months, So these are some of the challenges that we're dealing with. But I think it's really important to have these conversations early, with the payers, engage the experts to help us, in some of these analyses. And also to talk to some of these, to talk to the regulatory bodies about some of these issues as well. In terms of the registry, it's something that we're excited about, given that the disease that we're working in is degenerative. So we want to see the long-term benefit. At minimum, if the patients are not losing any further vision, over a long period of time, that would be, life-changing.
Right.
So, we're paying attention to all of these issues.
Yeah, just connecting the dots on I think all of your comments, it does seem like the environment now, the healthcare system that we opened the discussion with, they're going to be receptive to helping them understand the patient perspective. So you can look at each stakeholder. Regulators, they've made it pretty clear, FDA and EMA, they want to be more quantitative in measuring benefit risk. And when they're running their committee meetings and evaluating products, it's not enough only to have a patient tell their anecdotal story. That's important, it's powerful, but it's not enough to sort of systematically understand what it means to their life. And there's now new techniques, science-based quantitative techniques for measuring that. And really, you all are in a unique position because of the nature of your products being patient-centric and being high-touch to potentially go out there, either create a methodology or reapply a methodology to determining how are they doing, how are they living their life differently, their activities in daily living, for instance, based on improved eyesight. And this is something I think regulators would be receptive to, and you walk the halls of the big payers, it's the same thing. How do we become more patient-centric? How do we understand their personal assessment of risk and benefit?
So John, I think I think it's a great idea. I think where I struggle as a developer is how much we can take on in small biotech. I think the manufacturing alone of our product is so complex, and ensuring chain of custody, chain of identity, the logistic trail, right? All the things to ensure safety for that patient dose is so critical to me. But to your point, I think these things are absolutely needed. So for me, I'd love to hear others' ideas too of who can help with this, because I just think as a biotech company with limited resource, right, our focus can only be on so many things at one time, but I think it's an excellent point.
I might also say that based on what I'm listening to and I know of in this industry, there's a very patient-centric approach to designing trials. And it's almost like what they say in Silicon Valley as design thinking, where you really put a human at the center of your design and think through how are they going to use the product, how are they going to benefit from the product. So there might be something you're doing naturally that you can just begin to monitor, even digitally, in terms of measuring their experience, that then could create a lot of value in the healthcare system. Because the regulators and other stakeholders, they don't have that same window of insight that comes back so early that you guys are developing. What do you think?
And I do think it comes back to the convergence between the regulator and HTA body, that I alluded before. Because, for example, if you see the adaptive pathway initiative in Europe, all was about putting together at the same table regulator, developer, HTA bodies and payer, but also advocacy group. And in order to discuss, appropriate endpoint for the clinical trial. And as you have said, for example, in primary immune deficiency, of course, first focus would be survival and event-free survival. This is no question about that. But then for secondary endpoints that might matter, it's all about, infection, quality of life, and so on. And then you can leverage, based on family input, patient input, how important it is, for the patient. And I do think, regulator, but also, and maybe it's not exactly my field, but HTA payer will care, about this. Another point I wanted to make about our own experience with sophisticated module, for price and reimbursement. I would say the rarer is the condition, the less keen are payer, to go with complex, approach for price and reimbursement. So it's also something that you need to take into consideration, while moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, there's significant startup costs from a payer perspective in investing in a program where they're going to co-measure treatment process and outcomes. So you're right. And some of the other things that payers have articulated as challenges to cell and gene therapy developers are a lack of comparative data, lack of long-term data, and inappropriate endpoints that reflect real-world practice as opposed to a clinical trial setting. So these are things that potentially, you've all mentioned, registries and potential databases where we could glean some of those insights. And Avi, I'll go back to something that you had mentioned earlier. Payers look at it as, once a payer drew a very simple picture for me, and they said, here's a funnel. These developers bring us data on the small end of the funnel, and I have to cover patients on the wide end of the funnel in terms of all the diversity of of comorbidities and age demographics and lack of adherence and lack of providers following evidence-based medicine. So who's going to cover me for all that uncertainty?
I think there's a question that I can pick up, and if I'll tie it into a theme that emerged just a short while back. In fact, even in the earlier panel. We have traditionally looked at these sort of population health-related large diseases that affect population health and costs and benefits. And someone alluded to the Framingham risk assessment, which is as gosh darn large and cross-sectional as we can get. And those of us who worked in cardiovascular disease sets recognize that trying to draw from that to smaller patient population sets to prove efficacy and cost benefit was very hard, because cross-sectional sets are great. And payers love them because they're large numbers. But when we're actually developing a drug, what we think about is, can we save a life? Or can we change that life for the better? And can I quantify that benefit? And then can I do the benefit versus cost and get to a price point? And can I generate the evidence to support that, right? So that it's reasonably simplistic at that end. Orphan diseases and many of the early applications of our space, Regen Med, are almost the antithesis of the large cross-sectional approaches. I think our argument with payers is going to have to be this. Some of the models you're bringing, the cross-sectional models with large patient population sets, we'll get to that. But we're not even bringing diseases that match that. We're bringing diseases which are, in your first case, I think 100 patients, and looking at Ann and Orchard and ADA, SCID, right? We're looking at patient sets that are so small that I'm going to be flippant with the payer. Who cares? Who cares about your big funnel? Let's save these lives. Let's figure out what the system cost would have been if we had continued with medicine as usual today. And then let's figure out what the cost reimbursement ought to be to justify bringing a therapy like this to market. Down the road, there'll be all this variance that will come about as we get to larger disease sets. I mean, there's people in the earlier panel today who are already thinking about cardiovascular and CNS, and as we get to those kinds of applications, this point is really valid.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I want to engage in that discussion right now.
Paul, do you want to comment?
Yeah, I mean, we hear a lot about challenges, and I just want to point out that we have actually had a recent pleasant surprise on this topic, and maybe we're fortunate that Spark to some degree has paved the way in our particular indication. But in our experience, FDA is paying a lot of attention to some of these secondary endpoints that I think might have been discounted in the past and are definitely not discounted currently, particularly in our program. And the payers are too. And that came out very clearly in a pharmacoeconomic study that we did. We were surprised at how much attention they are paying. So for example, when we started our development many years back, it was always best corrected visual acuity. That was it. And then of course as Spark started to have more and more discussions with the FDA about incorporating some of the mobility tests, and then even how that correlates to quality of life. I think that was an education process. Again, it's really specific to us, but it's been a pleasant surprise. So hopefully there'll be more pleasant surprises and less challenges for us as an industry in the future as we continue to go along this path.
On that uplifting note, maybe I'll turn to the audience and see. It seems like, just like when preparing for launch, you feel like you're in time warp and time accelerates. The clock just went from 10 to 5.
Oh, wow.
So it seems like we're in a countdown. So if anybody has questions for the panel, please just grab a mic and ask away. In the meantime, I'll ask another. I was meeting with a CEO of a patient advocacy group not too long ago, and his theme, communication to me, was I want to be considered not just as a source for clinical trials, because it's an orphan disease, and he had sort of a very good working relationship with a few different CEOs of smaller biotech and even a large pharma company. But he said, I want them to see me as a channel to reach into my patient network, which he actually had built a pretty neat technological platform for data sharing, for patient experience, and essentially just to keep them connected. And I was curious what you all thought about connecting with patient advocates to go beyond what historically we've done just to raise awareness and to recruit for clinical trials. What else is going on in your companies with patient advocacy?
So it's an excellent point that I think I'm guilty of when I look at the way we've had outreach with advocacy, and it is just that. It's clinical trial recruitment, awareness, education, and I think while that's very important, I think you're right. I think we have to do a better job, and I'll give the example of patient-reported outcomes, right? Something that regulators are liking to see more and more in our clinical trials, and I struggle with the cell and gene therapy space that the PRO measures are not the relevant ones. We're not capturing the right information. And so what better way to engage a patient advocacy organization to let them tell us what should those be, and then you have, right, your proof for the regulators that you're looking at the right elements and the right endpoints. I think we all sit in our silos at our companies, and we work with our health outcomes teams and our physicians and others, our biostatisticians, and we think we have all the answers. So to me, it's a great takeaway that I'm going to go back and do a better job of leveraging those advocacy organizations for something like that.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. At Orchard, we are very close connection with PID and MPS advocacy group. Again, it's a small, really small field, so they help us dramatically, access the patient, giving feedback with questionnaire to the families and so on.
Excellent. Paul, give you a shot to...
Yeah, I mean, it hasn't been so relevant for us at this stage, but we anticipate that it will be as we continue out of it. We are an orphan disease, but still one of the larger populations in an orphan disease, so it's less relevant for us.
Avi, in closing about the patient.
Thank you. The patient and patient advocacy, clearly patient advocacy organizations represent a channel to patients, not just to access them for clinical studies, but to draw meaningful insights on what matters and how therapy is working, right? There's a field, and I'm forgetting the name, and please forgive me, it's a very common name, it's just a senior moment kind of thing. It queries things like Facebook and Google searches and comes back based on search patterns and personally given information in profiles like Facebook and Instagram and Twitter and so on. It essentially creates these mini communities that we can now use that also serve a patient advocacy channel type approach. It actually lets us develop communities of like-minded people who might well be talking about similar symptoms, might be describing their own disease type, and might well be talking about responses to drugs, which is a very beneficial thing if you're actually doing a clinical study but not tapping into these additional outcomes that might be gathered through that community. It feels like this is a fast-moving space and ties into a theme I was talking about earlier, which is big data and analytics. We have the ability now to do wonderful stuff.
Awesome. Well, let's give a round of applause for the panel. Thank you so much.